First sight. The night was calm when the first trace appeared, a faint blur against the velvet backdrop of stars, caught not by human eyes but by the sensitive array of a wide-field sky survey. Astronomers had seen countless comets before, icy wanderers that brightened as sunlight peeled layers of dust from their frozen shells. But this one felt different from the beginning. The designation arrived quickly. 3I divided by Atlas, the third recognized interstellar object to intrude upon the solar system. To most, the numbers and letters meant little, just another entry in a long catalogue of celestial bodies. But to those watching the screens in the control rooms of the Mauna Loa and Haleakala observatories, it was a ripple in the ordinary, a signal that something out there was moving too fast, too strangely, and shining far too bright. At first, the team assumed the glow was a calibration error. The object's magnitude exceeded what a freshly entered interstellar body should have, especially at such distance. They ran diagnostics on the sensors, checked against backup systems, and compared across separate observatories. The readings aligned. 3I divided by Atlas was bright, unnaturally bright, its light profile spiking higher than anything comparable. It looked less like dust scattering sunlight and more like something pouring energy outward. Astronomers are trained to remain calm before anomalies, but in the quiet tension of that room, silence spoke louder than words. Soon, whispers drifted across the networked community of skywatchers, from amateurs with backyard telescopes to professionals buried in data streams. Each confirmed what the others had seen, a luminosity that refused to obey expectations. The brightness curve did not fluctuate in the erratic pattern of a comet's volatile ices. Instead, it burned steadily, like a torch held aloft in the darkness of interstellar space. It was steady enough to measure, consistent enough to model, and strange enough to unnerve even the most seasoned veterans of cometary science. Beyond the walls of observatories, beyond the software and datasets, there were the people themselves, the tired astronomers who had grown used to comets arriving like clockwork, each obeying the same physics. They had dedicated lives to these frozen relics, the shards of formation that clung to the edges of suns. But now, something in the way 3I divided by Atlas shimmered left them feeling as though they were staring at a secret, one not meant to be revealed so easily. A secret that pulsed faintly against the void, waiting for someone bold enough to ask why. Night after night, the object grew brighter as it approached, not in the way comets burst alive when warmed by solar heat, spewing tails of gas and ice, but in a more controlled fashion, as though an internal source was feeding it from within. The coma surrounding it glowed too evenly, too perfectly distributed, lacking the chaotic streaks normally etched across such bodies. It was not a comet in any recognizable sense, yet for lack of any other category, it was called one. Words had to fit into established boxes, even when reality refused. To the world beyond the observatories, the news meant little more than another curiosity in the sky. Press releases described it as an interstellar comet, a distant traveler passing through, beautiful but harmless. But within the quiet corridors of research institutes, behind doors where unpolished data was shared in hurried confidence, a more unsettling question began to take form. What force could make a body from the stars shine brighter than any comet ever seen, without tearing itself apart? And so, the first sighting of 3I divided by Atlas did more than expand the human catalogue of objects. It planted the seed of doubt, the kind that spread slowly, creeping through the minds of scientists as they stared at data too clean, too sharp, too deliberate. For every answer they offered, another question grew. Some smiled with the thrill of discovery, others frowned with unease. Yet all of them looked again and again at the numbers, and all of them came to the same silent conclusion. This was no ordinary comet, a stranger in the sky. As the days passed and 3I divided by Atlas drifted closer, the math told a story that no one could ignore. Its orbit was wrong, completely wrong. Calculations showed a hyperbolic trajectory, cutting across the solar system at a speed no bound comet could sustain. It wasn't circling the sun like a loyal planet, nor was it even temporarily captured like some errant asteroid. Instead, it was only visiting, gliding in from the deep void between stars, destined to exit and never return. That realization came like a shiver, echoing the first time humanity had encountered such a wanderer, Oumuamua in 2017. But where Oumuamua had been a dark, oddly shaped shard, 3I divided by Atlas blazed as though carrying a lantern through the night. Astronomers across continents began feeding its motion into simulations, tracing its path backwards, trying to find a birthplace. They expected it to lead toward a young star cluster, a system where violent forces might fling icy debris outward into interstellar exile. Yet no solution fit neatly. Instead, the trajectory pointed to emptiness, to a region of space where no such nursery thrived. That made little sense. If not a star's chaotic slingshot, then what had sent it sailing through the galaxy? No natural explanation sat comfortably on their charts. Among the chatter in online astronomy forums and hushed discussions at conferences, comparisons to Oumuamua became unavoidable. That earlier visitor had puzzled scientists by its acceleration and lack of a cometary tail. Many had speculated wildly an alien probe, a fragment of a shattered world, a frozen hydrogen iceberg. But where that first case eventually faded into silence, Atlas struck differently. Its luminous presence made denial harder. This was not just a curiosity slipping away quietly. This was a beacon, a light so fierce it demanded to be seen. In the control rooms of major observatories, veterans remembered how quickly the world had forgotten Oumuamua. They wondered whether the same fate awaited Atlas, whether curiosity would again fade into dismissal. But in their private notes, they admitted what the brightness meant. This object was not behaving like anything nature had prepared them for. Its coma was too uniform, its energy too sustained, and its origin too ambiguous. For those who tracked it hour by hour, Atlas was a stranger, not only in trajectory but in essence. Governments and agencies began to take notice, though quietly. Official press statements emphasized the scientific interest and rare opportunity of another interstellar visitor, but buried deeper, encrypted emails and closed meetings carried a more urgent tone. If such an object could carry energy so unusual, then ignoring it would be a mistake. Even if harmless, even if merely a natural oddity, the knowledge it carried could alter what humanity thought it knew about cosmic matter. And if not harmless, well, no one dared to write that down. For amateur skywatchers, the spectacle was beautiful. Telescopes across backyards captured faint green halos, processed images showed the glowing head, and online forums buzzed with excitement. But those outside the scientific circles saw only what they were told. A comet, rare and lovely, a gift of chance. Few could sense the tension pressing down on those who knew the numbers, who saw that this comet refused to behave. Few felt the cold recognition that it was more like an emissary than a wanderer. The name itself, 3I divided by Atlas, was bland, clinical, stripped of wonder. But behind the name was a truth both exhilarating and unsettling. This was the second interstellar body to break the silence of the galaxy within mere decades, after billions of years of solitude. If two had already arrived, then how many more drifted unseen, crossing the vast between suns? Were they countless, scattered like dust in the galactic wind? Or were they rare, deliberate, and perhaps not so accidental? That question hung unspoken, heavy in the minds of those who studied the stranger blazing in the sky. The light that shouldn't be. From the first measurements, astronomers were caught in a paradox. A comet that shines is no surprise. Sunlight vaporizes its icy skin, releasing plumes of gas and dust that scatter brilliance across millions of kilometers. But 3I divided by Atlas burned too evenly, too strongly, with none of the chaos that usually accompanies sublimation. Instead of irregular bursts, jets, and uneven tails, its glow was steady, almost disciplined. To the trained eye, it looked less like the product of crumbling ice, and more like a lamp drawing from some hidden reservoir of power. Spectroscopic data deepened the mystery. Instruments expected to capture the telltale fingerprints of water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane molecules that mark a comet's identity. But the signals came back faint, weak to the point of near absence. What dominated instead were broad-spectrum emissions, a flat, unnatural spread across the wavelengths, as though the object were pouring out pure radiance rather than reflecting sunlight. This was not how comets shone. This was how engineered light sources operated. Scientists working in the quiet hours of the night began writing notes that they dared not share publicly. The light curve does not fit any known sublimation model, one draft report read. Another suggested, almost reluctantly, possible unknown energy release mechanism. They hesitated, struck by the weight of such words. To claim an unknown source was to step into the dangerous realm of speculation, a place where careers could be dismantled by ridicule. Yet the numbers refused to yield to conventional explanation. The deeper question was not just why it shone, but how it sustained that brightness over such a vast journey. Interstellar space was cold, emptier than any vacuum created on Earth, a place where energy bled away quickly. A comet ejected from its home star should grow dark in that infinite chill, becoming a frozen stone wandering without warmth. Yet 3I divided by Atlas glimmered with persistent intensity, as though it carried a secret furnace within. Whispers began to spread in research circles. Could it be that Atlas held a radioactive heart, some fragment of a neutron star collision, its isotopes decaying with relentless heat? Or perhaps it carried exotic ice, hydrogen or helium in a metastable form, releasing energy unknown to Earth-bound laboratories. These theories danced at the edge of plausibility, but none satisfied the central dilemma. How could such a small body radiate so much without destroying itself? The public never heard these doubts. Press briefings remained calm, polished, delivered with the quiet authority of science. Words like rare, enigmatic, and fascinating painted the picture of a harmless curiosity. But in late-night phone calls between astronomers, in unrecorded conversations held after conferences, the mood shifted. They admitted to one another that something was profoundly wrong. Nature does not waste energy in straight lines, yet Atlas seemed to do just that, beaming its presence across space, bright as a warning flare. The strangest detail was its consistency. Normal comets spin, tumble, fracture under their own volatile eruptions, their brightness waxing and waning. But Atlas presented a smooth profile, with brightness increasing exactly as though controlled by a dimmer knob. That kind of steadiness suggested intention, or at the very least, a process far beyond current understanding of natural physics. It was as though the object wanted to be seen, wanted its light to be noticed by whatever eyes might be searching the dark. Within a few weeks, the debates behind closed doors shifted from technical puzzles to deeper, almost philosophical dread. What if this was not a comet at all? What if the very act of calling it one was misleading, a comfort against the truth? The data kept returning the same impossible answer. The light of 3I divided by Atlas should not be. And yet, night after night, there it burned, defiant, patient, unexplainable. Reports in the shadows. The official papers spoke with restraint, but in the shadows, other documents circulated. They were not meant for public release, not even for wide academic sharing. These were internal memos, clipped and hurried, stamped with confidential headers, routed only to trusted colleagues through secure channels. They told a version of the story that could not appear in journals. 3I divided by Atlas was emitting energy that no comet should emit. One memo described spectral readings that showed spikes of radiation inconsistent with sublimation. Another flagged unusual fluctuations in its surrounding plasma environment. The kind of disturbances that implied something active, not passive, was stirring within its core. A third, leaked from an observatory in South America, noted the faint but persistent presence of structured pulses in the data patterns that should have dissolved into randomness if they were mere noise. Instead, they lingered, repeating just enough to sow doubt. Those who read the leaks were unsettled. These weren't wild speculations from fringe enthusiasts. They came from seasoned observers, some with reputations built on decades of meticulous work. If they were whispering of anomalies, it meant the anomalies were real. Yet none of them dared to speak openly. They knew how quickly a career could collapse under accusations of sensationalism. Better to remain silent, to share doubts only in private, to hide them in documents not meant to survive the light of scrutiny. Among the leaked fragments, one stood out. It came from a midnight session at an Arctic observatory, where the long polar night made for uninterrupted viewing. The astronomer on duty logged an unusual spike in brightness so sudden, so sharp, that it looked like a flare being lit. Yet within minutes, the glow returned to its steady pattern, as if the flare had never happened. The log entry ended with a single line, typed hesitantly. It responded as though to attention. This report, circulated quietly among trusted peers, ignited unease. What could it mean for a comet to respond? Was it merely coincidence, a fluctuation in solar wind, a hiccup in instrumentation? Or was there something deeper, something intentional, in the way the light had surged? Few dared to say it aloud, but the implication hovered like a shadow. Perhaps 3I divided by Atlas was aware. National agencies began tightening their grip on the data, Access that had once been free to the global community was suddenly restricted, requiring new permissions. Requests for raw observations were delayed or denied. Press releases grew vaguer, filled with soothing platitudes about the beauty of interstellar visitors. To the casual eye, nothing had changed. But to those watching closely, the shift was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, wanted the truth of Atlas hidden. And yet, suppression always breeds resistance. A handful of independent astronomers, distrustful of official channels, began their own secret collaborations. They pooled data, compared notes, and built encrypted networks to share what governments would not. These underground threads whispered of energy levels that climbed without any source to explain them, of light profiles that seemed too symmetrical, too precise. One group even claimed to have detected a faint secondary source like a kernel of light embedded within the larger glow, radiating as though from a compact engine. As these rumors spread, the mood in scientific circles split. Some dismissed them outright, clinging to conventional explanations: exotic ice, hidden chemistry, measurement errors. Others, though, leaned into the unease. They remembered how easily Oumuamua had been brushed aside, how quickly uncomfortable questions had been buried. They were not willing to let that happen again. For them, Atlas was more than a comet. It was a test, a challenge, perhaps even a revelation. But revelations do not come without fear, and in the shadows of these reports, fear was the constant undertone. Fear that the object's light was not accidental. Fear that something beyond human comprehension had brushed against the solar system, and fear that those in power knew far more than they were willing to admit. Theories that frightened scientists. The scientists who lived closest to the enigma of 3i divided by Atlas rarely spoke their boldest thoughts aloud. They whispered them in corridors, scribbled them in notebooks never meant for peer review, muttered them after long nights at observatories when fatigue lowered defenses. Theories took root in those quiet hours, ideas so wild they frightened even those who proposed them. The first theory was chemical. Perhaps Atlas was made of an exotic substance unknown to Earth, a kind of ice that released energy differently when struck by sunlight. Some speculated about supervolatile compounds, long-lived isotopes frozen in alien reservoirs. But the data resisted this comfort. No spectral signature matched the expected fingerprints of such chemistry. The glow was too broad, too featureless, as though it wasn't chemistry at all but something more fundamental. The second theory was catastrophic. Some believed 3i divided by Atlas might be a fragment of a neutron star collision, a sliver of material hurled across the galaxy in a cosmic blast billions of years ago. If that were true, its brightness could be explained by radioactive decay of heavy elements, uranium, thorium, or even stranger isotopes forged in stellar furnaces. Yet this explanation carried its own terror. If Atlas were truly such a fragment, it would not merely glow, it would be deadly, spewing radiation at levels dangerous even from afar. Instruments showed no such lethal emissions. The radioactive heart, if it existed, hid itself too well. The third theory crossed the line from science into myth. A handful of astrophysicists, half in jest and half in dread, whispered that Atlas might not be natural at all. The steadiness of its glow, the way it seemed to brighten deliberately, the structured pulses in leaked reports, it resembled not a comet, but a machine. Perhaps it was built, they said, crafted by hands or minds beyond Earth. Some compared it to a probe, a vessel powered by technologies humanity could not yet imagine. Others said it might be a warning beacon, a relic left to signal across the galaxy, like a lighthouse on interstellar seas. Of all the theories, this was the most dangerous. No one could write it in official documents without risking ridicule. But in private circles, the thought pressed heavier than all the rest. If Atlas were artificial, then it meant humanity was no longer alone. More than that, it meant someone, somewhere, wanted to be noticed. And there was a fourth theory, whispered more reluctantly still, that Atlas was neither a comet, nor a fragment, nor a machine, but something alive in a way humans had never conceived. A vast organism, feeding on energies of the stars, glowing as part of its life cycle. The idea sounded absurd, fantastical, a fever dream pulled from science fiction. Yet some could not dismiss it. The regularity of its light, the smoothness of its energy release it, bore the quiet rhythm of biology. Every theory brought with it fear. Exotic chemistry suggested the universe still held secrets beyond reach. A radioactive shard meant the solar system had been brushed by stellar catastrophe. An alien machine implied watchful intelligences in the dark. A living traveler suggested life itself had forms humanity could not imagine. In every version, the universe grew larger, stranger, more dangerous. What united all these theories was their impossibility. Each required breaking what was known, bending the laws of physics and chemistry into untested shapes. Yet the data demanded it. Something about Atlas was wrong, and the wrongness could not be dismissed by comfortable logic. Scientists feared ridicule, but more than that, they feared the truth, that the brightness of Atlas was not a mistake of instruments, but a message written into the sky itself. And so the theories multiplied, filling whispered conversations and hidden reports. But with every new possibility came the same haunting conclusion. Whatever Atlas was, it was not what humanity had been prepared to find. Tracing its birthplace, once the excitement of discovery settled into the rhythm of data collection, astronomers turned their attention to the most fundamental question. Where had 3I divided by Atlas come from? The motion of any interstellar visitor, when traced backward, can act like a thread leading into the vast tapestry of the galaxy. If one could follow the thread long enough, perhaps it would reveal the origin star, the place where this luminous wanderer had been born or expelled. Teams across the globe fed Atlas's trajectory into supercomputers. They used gravitational models, accounting for the pull of the sun, the planets, even distant Jupiter's subtle tug. The object's path was hyperbolic, unmistakably unbound, cutting through the solar system at a speed that denied capture. That much was clear, but when they rolled the clock back, letting the models unwind its journey, the results grew strange. Instead of pointing to a bustling nursery of young stars or a violent binary system, the trace led to emptiness, an expanse of space with no obvious parent. Some simulations suggested it might have come from the general direction of the Hercules constellation, a quiet sector without dramatic activity in recent astronomical records. Others pointed to a void between the spiral arms, a dark gulf where nothing nearby could have flung such an object outward. That contradiction gnawed at researchers. Objects do not simply appear from nowhere. They are ejected, torn free, accelerated by some force. If not by the violence of a forming star system, then by what? A few dared to imagine that Atlas had traveled longer than any previous interstellar body ever tracked. Perhaps it had wandered for billions of years, a relic older than Earth itself, expelled during an age when stars were closer, when collisions were more common. That thought lent the comet an eerie weight, as though it carried with it not just alien material but alien time, a fragment of history predating the solar system. But even this possibility failed to answer the central riddle. How could such an ancient traveler still shine so brightly? Others entertained darker ideas. What if Atlas had not been ejected randomly at all? What if its course had been chosen, its trajectory guided toward the solar system with deliberate intent? The brightness, the steadiness, the strange lack of a visible origin, all these details wove together into a story some were too nervous to articulate. Yet the suspicion lingered. Atlas might not be a lost child of a distant star, but an emissary, its path not an accident, but a destination. In one particularly confidential meeting, a European team presented models suggesting Atlas had passed suspiciously close to 2 dim stars, roughly 500,000 years ago. Those encounters could not account fully for its velocity, but they hinted at gravitational nudges, as though the object had been shepherded along its way. Some participants left that meeting unsettled, whispering afterward that such a course looked less like the random scatter of physics and more like the careful alignment of design. Meanwhile, historians of science and myth were drawn into the puzzle. Ancient records often described luminous visitors, flaming swords, heavenly torches, fires that crossed the sky without tails. Could some of those accounts have been interstellar travelers like Atlas, passing unnoticed into human memory before telescopes could capture them? If so, then perhaps Earth had been brushed by such objects before, each one a silent wanderer, with no known home. The thought deepened the sense of unease. How many such travelers had slipped past unseen, and why was this one making itself impossible to ignore? Every attempt to trace Atlas back led not to answers, but to more questions. The models diverged, contradicting one another, as though the object's past resisted being known. It was like trying to follow footprints across shifting sand. The trail blurred, dissolved, and finally vanished into nothing. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth of all. that Atlas's birthplace was not just unknown, but unknowable. For a scientific community built on cause and origin, this was intolerable. Nothing in the universe should lack a source. Nothing should defy the logic of where it came from. Yet Atlas did, and with each failed attempt to chart its past, the question grew heavier. If its birthplace could not be found, was it because it had never truly had one? Unsettling anomalies. The longer scientists observed 3I divided by Atlas, the more the details began to unsettle them. At first, it was just the light, too steady, too strong. But soon, the anomalies piled into something larger, something that resisted every natural explanation. The first anomaly was in its flickering patterns. Instruments designed to measure variations in brightness picked up faint pulses, almost rhythmic. To the untrained eye, they looked like statistical noise, the kind of fluctuations that come when photons scatter through space. But when teams in Europe, Asia, and South America compared their recordings, the patterns aligned. The flickers weren't random. They followed intervals, repeating faintly like the beat of a distant drum. No known comet behaved this way. The second anomaly lay in the distribution of its coma. Instead of ragged, uneven jets spraying outward, Atlas glowed in a perfectly symmetrical halo. Gas seemed to drift evenly in all directions, defying the chaotic vents usually carved into a comet's surface. High-resolution imaging suggested that the coma wasn't being shaped by sunlight or solar wind alone. It seemed as though something inside the object was regulating the flow, maintaining balance. Natural bodies do not regulate. They erupt and fracture. Regulation implied intention. Then there was the issue of motion. When astronomers plotted Atlas's trajectory, they noticed tiny deviations from the path gravity alone would dictate. These were not dramatic, not enough to alarm the general public, but precise instruments revealed shifts too consistent to be dismissed. The changes resembled controlled corrections, as though the object was subtly guiding itself, nudging its path without the violent outgassing that normally explains cometary drift. Reports from independent observatories began circulating quietly online. Some claimed Atlas's spectrum contained strange narrow peaks, frequencies that seemed out of place in natural emissions, clustered in ranges commonly used in radio communication. Others dismissed this as interference, the bleed of human technology into sensitive instruments. But those who had seen the raw data swore the peaks were real, embedded in the object's light itself. As these anomalies multiplied, the sense of unease deepened. A few scientists risked private speculation. What if the flickers were signals, the symmetrical coma, an engineered shield, the trajectory shifts, deliberate maneuvers? The idea bordered on heresy, yet it explained more than the official line could. For every conventional model applied to Atlas, one detail or another slipped through the cracks. But the moment one allowed the possibility of design, of technology, the pieces fit too easily. Governments, too, began to notice. Defense agencies commissioned their own studies, bypassing academic institutions. Satellites were reoriented, some publicly for astronomical research, others in ways no one explained. In hushed tones, it was said that military sensors had detected emissions from Atlas not visible to civilian equipment, faint bursts of energy at regular intervals. None of this made it into public statements. Officially, Atlas was still a comet, rare and beautiful, a visitor from the stars. Unofficially, it was a growing question mark, one that agencies were in no hurry to share with the public. The strangest anomaly of all was recorded by a telescope in Chile. During a night of unusually clear skies, the object brightened, not gradually, not in the smooth curve astronomers had grown used to, but in a sudden surge like a lamp being turned up. For precisely 27 minutes, Atlas shone more intensely than ever before. Then, just as suddenly, the light returned to its steady state. The logbook entry that followed was chilling in its simplicity. Brightness increased abruptly, no cause identified. Possible external trigger? ISREF. In the following days, when researchers compared global data, they realized the surge had occurred exactly when several classified satellites had been repositioned to observe it. The coincidence gnawed at them. Was it a mere accident of timing? Or had Atlas reacted acknowledging that it was being watched? The anomalies refused to remain isolated curiosities. Together, they painted a portrait of something far from natural, an object that flickered with rhythm, glowed with symmetry, adjusted its path with subtle care, and seemed to know when it was being observed. Astronomers who once smiled at the wonder of a new interstellar comet now carried unease in their eyes. For all the data they collected, one conclusion became harder to avoid. Atlas was not simply a visitor, it was a presence. The disbeliever's voice. For every whisper of anomaly, there was a counter-voice eager to dismiss it. Skepticism is the lifeblood of science, and many in the community were unwilling to let 3I divided by Atlas slip into the realm of speculation. To them, it was simply another icy wanderer, no different in essence from comets catalogued for centuries. The brightness, they argued, was only a matter of timing and angle. The flickers were mere artifacts of instrumentation. The trajectory shifts were normal cometary outgassing, magnified by overly sensitive measurements. These disbelievers spoke with confidence at conferences and in journals. They rolled their eyes at the leaked reports, calling them fringe interpretations or misreadings. They reminded everyone how quickly people had leapt to wild conclusions about Oumuamua, only to be chastened when better models suggested mundane explanations. "We must not repeat the same mistake," one prominent astronomer warned, her voice cutting through a crowded hall. "The data are unusual, yes, but unusual is not impossible. It is only science doing its work." Yet beneath their arguments, there was a tremor of unease. Many skeptics had not seen the raw data themselves, relying instead on the cleaned, publicly released sets. When pressed about the restricted reports, they shrugged them off as classified for administrative reasons. They could not explain why governments had begun quietly controlling access to information, nor why international observatories suddenly required special permissions. To question that too loudly would have been to admit that something might truly be hidden. Still, the skeptics found comfort in numbers. They pointed out that the human brain is wired to see patterns where none exist, to mistake randomness for design. The flickering of Atlas could be nothing more than the statistical noise of scattered photons. The symmetry of its coma could be an illusion created by low-resolution images. Even the sudden surges of brightness could be explained by jets of volatile gas bursting from beneath the surface, rare, but not unprecedented. Nature is capable of surprises, one paper concluded, without resorting to science fiction. But in the darker corners of academia, a parallel discussion unfolded. Some skeptics had received access to the classified data, and while they would not say so publicly, their private doubts gnawed at them. They dismissed the wilder claims, but still they lay awake at night, staring at their ceiling, wondering why they could not shake the feeling that something about Atlas refused to fit into neat categories. They spoke loudly in public, but their silence in private betrayed unease. The louder the skeptics grew, the more the other side hardened. Believers in the anomalies pointed to the dismissals as evidence of suppression, of deliberate blindness. They argued that the skeptics were not merely defending science but defending stability, afraid of what would happen if humanity admitted it was seeing something it could not explain. Skepticism, in that sense, became more than science. It became a shield against fear. For the public, the skeptics' voices carried the most weight. News reports repeated their words, assuring audiences that Atlas was strange, yes, but not threatening. It was simply another reminder of how vast the universe was and how little humanity understood. But behind that reassurance, for those who had seen the hidden documents, the skeptics' confidence felt hollow, brittle, like a wall built to keep out a tide too strong to resist. And yet, the skeptics served a purpose. Their presence allowed the world to keep moving, to keep sleeping soundly under the stars, to believe that the brightness overhead was only a comet. They gave humanity the gift of denial, of postponing the inevitable reckoning. But denial cannot change truth, and truth was drawing nearer every day, blazing across the dark sky with a light that refused to be ignored. Eyes beyond Earth. The astronomers on Earth were not the only ones watching 3I divided by Atlas. Long before its brightness drew the attention of the public, intelligence agencies had already marked it as a priority. In control rooms buried deep beneath mountains, behind the silent walls of classified installations, the order was given: redirect the satellites. At first, the satellites trained on Atlas were the usual scientific instruments: infrared surveyors, high-resolution optical imagers, orbital observatories meant for mapping distant galaxies. But soon, others followed. Classified arrays built not for astronomy but for surveillance. Military platforms that once scanned Earth's surface for missile launches now turned their lenses outward. Communication satellites tuned to intercept faint signals began sweeping the frequencies where Atlas's strange pulses had been reported. The results, though never publicly released, leaked in fragments through those who saw too much. They spoke of power outputs that dwarfed expectations, bursts of energy so far beyond what frozen ice could produce that even hardened analysts struggled to keep their voices steady when describing them. One report, whispered among researchers, claimed that Atlas's radiance at certain intervals equaled the energy output of small nuclear detonations, steady, controlled, not destructive, but impossibly intense for an object of its size. Infrared imaging revealed something even stranger. The coma surrounding Atlas glowed evenly, but at its heart there appeared to be a point of concentrated heat, a source hotter and sharper than the diffuse halo around it. It was as if a furnace burned within, small but fierce, unlike any process known to exist inside a comet. One technician, after reviewing the data, wrote in his private notes, "It looks less like a comet and more like an engine." The military minds who reviewed these findings did not think in terms of cosmic wonder, they thought in terms of threat. If Atlas carried a power source unlike anything known on Earth, then it represented either an opportunity or a danger. Could such energy be harnessed? Could it be weaponized? Or was it itself a weapon, drifting silently through the solar system, its purpose unreadable? These were questions the scientists dared not ask aloud, but the agencies could not avoid. As more satellites were redirected, a clearer picture emerged. Atlas was not just bright, it was consistent. The symmetry of its glow, the precision of its emissions, the faint but undeniable signals embedded within its flickers all pointed away from randomness. A pattern emerged, though no one could decode it. Some believed it was merely the resonance of natural processes. Others, more daring, wondered if it was a message not to humanity specifically, but to anyone watching. Outside the walls of secrecy, astronomers continued their work with limited data, forced to rely on scraps. They noticed that certain wavelengths of observation were suddenly off-limits, their requests for telescope time denied without explanation. Some grew suspicious, realizing that governments were watching Atlas with tools far beyond their reach. But suspicion could not yield proof, and proof was guarded by silence. There was one incident, however, that slipped beyond containment. An amateur radio operator in Finland, scanning the skies as a hobby, intercepted a faint signal coinciding with the exact moment Atlas flared. It was little more than a thin pulse, repeating at regular intervals, but it was enough to cause chatter in underground forums. The operator described it as a heartbeat in the dark. Within days, his post vanished, and his account was deleted. But the memory of what he had heard spread like wildfire among those who were already watching the watchers. The eyes beyond Earth were no longer just astronomers searching for knowledge. They were governments searching for advantage, militaries preparing for possibilities, intelligence networks weaving secrets into silence. Atlas had become more than a comet, more than a curiosity. It was now an object of surveillance, a target of suspicion, a mirror in which humanity projected its hopes and fears, and through it all, the object continued to blaze, unbothered, unchanging, as though it knew it was being watched and did not mind at all. The silence of agencies. The more three-eye divided by Atlas revealed of itself, the quieter the official voices became. At first, agencies spoke with the usual enthusiasm, press releases, celebrating the discovery of a rare interstellar comet, interviews with smiling scientists describing how much could be learned from such a visitor. But as the weeks passed, the tone shifted. Updates grew vague, words like enigmatic and unique, replacing detailed explanations. Journalists began to notice the change. Reports that once flowed freely were now little more than recycled phrases. Inside observatories, the change was even sharper. Requests for data were suddenly delayed, denied, or heavily redacted. Researchers who had once shared nightly updates found themselves locked out of servers, their access revoked without warning. When they asked why, they were told only that the information had been reclassified. A strange phrase for astronomy, a field built on openness, collaboration, and the shared wonder of the sky. Rumors circulated that closed-door meetings were being held between leading astrophysicists and representatives of government defense departments. These gatherings left no public record, no minutes, no live streams for the curious. Yet word slipped out from those who attended. Officials asked not about cometary chemistry or orbital mechanics, but about energy, propulsion, and whether the object might alter course in ways no natural body should, questions more suited to military threat assessments than to science. The silence grew louder with each passing day. A journalist in Washington who pressed for access to internal reports was told bluntly to drop the story. A European observatory director, after hinting in an interview that Atlas's brightness defied explanation, was forced to retract her statement and issue a correction claiming her words had been taken out of context. And in China, a group of graduate students who posted raw spectral data online found their accounts suspended and their posts erased within hours. Yet silence has a way of breeding suspicion. The very absence of answers made people ask more questions. Why would governments restrict access to something so seemingly harmless? Why classify data about a comet? The official calm no longer reassured it unsettled. It suggested that the agencies knew something they could not, or would not, share. In the underground circles of independent astronomers, this silence became its own kind of evidence. If there was nothing unusual, one researcher wrote anonymously, they would flood us with data. They would overwhelm us with proof that it was ordinary. But instead, they withhold. And when they withhold, it is because they fear what the truth will say. Among intelligence agencies, the silence carried another meaning entirely. It was not just about fear of panic or the protection of scientific integrity. It was about control. If Atlas truly carried an impossible energy source, if it truly radiated with something beyond comprehension, then controlling that knowledge was as important as controlling the skies themselves. To reveal everything would be to admit vulnerability, to expose the limits of human understanding in front of the world. Better, then, to maintain the mask of calm and to say as little as possible. But silence does not erase the light in the sky. Anyone with a telescope could still see it. The brightness that refused to dim, the glow that burned steady and strange. The heavens themselves betrayed the quiet, reminding every curious soul who looked up that something extraordinary was passing by, no matter how hard agencies tried to soften the truth. And for those who knew how to listen, the silence of the agencies said more than their words ever could. It whispered of hidden fear, of secrets buried beneath layers of denial, and of a question so profound that no government dared to answer it aloud. What exactly was 3I divided by Atlas, and why did it shine like no comet ever should? Echoes of an ancient story. When silence fell from the agencies, others turned their attention not to satellites or telescopes, but to the archives of memory. Across cultures and centuries, stories have been carved into stone, painted onto cave walls, whispered in chants, and written in sacred texts. Stories of lights in the sky, of fire without smoke, of wandering torches that passed across the night with no tails. For some scholars, the enigma of 3I divided by Atlas stirred these old echoes, drawing ancient myth into the present moment. In the crumbling papyri of Egypt, there are references to the star that burned without dying, a glowing visitor that crossed the heavens without fading. Unlike ordinary comets which sputtered and broke apart, priests recorded its coming as both omen and wonder, claiming it marked a time when gods walked among men. Thousands of years later, anthropologists reviewing those fragments found eerie parallels to what Atlas displayed, a steady brilliance, unnatural in its persistence. Far to the east, in Chinese chronicles, there are descriptions of heaven's lantern, a radiant object that hung in the night for weeks, so luminous that farmers claimed they could work the fields by its glow. Unlike known comets catalogued by court astronomers, this object had no streaking tail. Instead, it gleamed like a perfect sphere. The chronicles describe fear among the emperor's advisors, who argued whether it signaled doom or blessing. Scholars now looked at those passages again, wondering if such accounts were not superstition but observation, evidence that other interstellar visitors had brushed Earth's skies in ages past. Among the Norse sagas, there is mention of the fire without ashes. Sailors on the cold seas spoke of a star so bright that it cast shadows upon the decks, yet no tale marked its passage. The sagas say it hummed in the silence of night, a detail often dismissed as poetic exaggeration. But to those now reviewing Atlas's strange flickering patterns, the word hummed carried unsettling resonance. Indigenous traditions from the Americas told similar stories. Some spoke of sky torches that arrived suddenly, brighter than the moon, and left without a trace. In certain Mayan codices, glyphs depict orbs surrounded not by streaking trails but by symmetrical halos, radiating evenly in all directions, an image hauntingly similar to the even coma of Atlas. For those who believed such visitors had been seen before, the connection was almost undeniable. These echoes of ancient story could not be dismissed entirely as coincidence. The human memory is long, if fragmented, and the sky has always been its canvas. To believers, the parallels proved that Atlas was not the first impossible light to pass by, only the first to be measured with modern instruments. To skeptics, the stories were simply mythic patterns, the imagination of people who knew less about the heavens than today's schoolchildren. Yet the resemblance was enough to trouble even the rational. One anthropologist, reviewing the breadth of these tales, remarked quietly to a colleague, "If these stories are true, then what we call myth might only be the record of encounters we chose not to understand." That thought, once spoken, spread quietly among scholars. What if human culture had been shaped in part by these interstellar wanderers' lights that appeared rarely but decisively, leaving impressions so deep they became legends? And so, the brightness of Atlas was no longer just a puzzle for physicists. It became a bridge between past and present, between myth and measurement. Its glow carried echoes of stories whispered long before telescopes existed, stories that now seemed less like fantasy and more like testimony. For those willing to hear, Atlas was not simply an object in the sky. It was a reminder that humanity had always been watched by lights it could not explain, and perhaps always would be. The impossible source. By now, every attempt to frame 3I divided by Atlas as a conventional comet had unraveled. What remained was a growing confrontation with the impossible. Its brightness did not diminish with distance in the way it should. Its glow did not match the messy release of volatile gases. Its core, inferred through layers of data, radiated too steadily, as though an unseen engine burned at its heart. Astronomers whispered of it as though it were less a comet and more a torch, burning from a source no one could name. The problem was energy. Physics allows for many wonders, but energy cannot simply appear. Every natural comet grows bright by sacrificing itself by shedding ice and dust, until nothing remains but a lifeless rock. Yet Atlas was losing almost nothing. Its mass remained largely intact, its coma symmetrical and thin, as if reluctant to expend material. And still it shone, its radiance stronger than many comets with tails stretching millions of kilometers. It glowed without paying the price. Some proposed that Atlas was tapping into solar radiation in an unknown way, absorbing and amplifying sunlight as though it possessed a hidden lens or a reflective lattice buried beneath its surface. Others suggested it might be a fragment of some exotic astrophysical body, containing matter so unstable that even in the void it released energy steadily. But these explanations strained under scrutiny. There was no evidence of amplification mechanisms, no signatures of exotic decay. The object's emission was simple, pure, unadorned, as though it had mastered the art of light itself. The more radical theories whispered of impossible physics. Perhaps Atlas was drawing on quantum vacuum energy, tapping into the seething background of the universe itself. Perhaps it contained matter humanity had never touched: negative mass, dark matter compounds, or materials forged in the heart of collapsed stars. Such ideas belonged more to speculation than science, but the numbers forced the conversation. For Atlas to glow as it did, it required an energy source beyond all known models, and yet the glow was real, measurable, undeniable. In private correspondence between observatories, the language grew darker. "It should not be," one researcher typed in a midnight email, "but it is." Another, more blunt, "We are staring at an energy source we cannot explain, and it is passing us by without slowing." These words did not appear in public papers, but they pulsed through hidden channels, circulating like forbidden knowledge. The most unnerving idea was that the energy source was deliberate. If Atlas were artificial, then its brightness could be the product of design, a beacon meant to be seen, a signal to any civilization capable of noticing. That thought terrified even the most imaginative. If humanity was seeing a beacon, then it meant someone had lit it, and if someone had lit it, then perhaps they were watching to see who noticed. But what made the mystery unbearable was the lack of answers. Observations piled higher, data sets grew richer, yet nothing explained the impossible source. Every new night brought more proof of the same truth. Atlas glowed with energy that could not be explained, could not be harnessed, could not be understood. It mocked the limits of science, carrying within it a light that was both invitation and warning. For centuries, humanity had looked at comets as harbingers, omens of change, symbols of disruption. Most had been nothing more than ice and dust. But this one, this impossible light, carried the weight of the old belief. For it was not simply a comet at all, but a message written in brightness. There are sources of power you do not yet know, and they pass you by in silence. And as the days stretched into weeks, one chilling question grew louder in the hearts of those who dared to ask it. If Atlas's light came from an impossible source, then what if anything prevented that same source from being turned toward a purpose humanity was not ready to face? Whispers of a core. As telescopes sharpened their gaze and satellites fed back streams of data, attention turned to the center of 3I divided by Atlas, the place where its impossible light seemed to originate. For weeks, astronomers debated whether there was something hidden beneath the coma, something far denser and stranger than ice or stone. What emerged from those hushed discussions was a theory that spread like wildfire in private circles. Atlas carried a core unlike anything ever seen before. High-resolution imaging suggested that beneath the smooth halo of gas and dust, there was a compact point of brightness that refused to blur, even when distance and atmosphere tried to smudge the details. Normally, a comet's nucleus is dark, cold, and barely visible, only revealed when its surrounding cloud thins. But Atlas was different. Its center was visible through its own glow, a condensed brilliance like a coal burning inside a lantern. The symmetry of the coma only reinforced the impression it seemed to be radiating outward from a singular source, not erupting chaotically from fractured vents. One group of European researchers, comparing infrared data, noticed something astonishing. The core appeared hotter than it should be, yet its temperature did not fluctuate. Unlike an icy nucleus that warms unevenly, venting as the sun's heat reached buried layers, Atlas's heart burned with a steady, almost mechanical precision. The numbers hinted at regulation, as if the brightness were being controlled, kept constant against the cold indifference of space. From this came the whispers. Some spoke of a compact engine, a dense knot of exotic matter sustaining its radiance. Others imagined a shard of a collapsed star, a fragment of neutronium or strange quark matter still leaking energy after an eternity of drift. Still others speculated that what lay inside was not natural at all, but a constructed core, designed to endure interstellar journeys while projecting light like a beacon. The whispers grew darker when paired with the anomalies of its path. If the core was powerful enough to generate such light, might it also be capable of altering the object's course? The tiny, precise deviations from a purely gravitational trajectory suddenly made sense in this context, not as accidents of gas jets, but as controlled adjustments fueled by whatever lay hidden at the heart of the comet. But to speak of such things aloud was dangerous. At international conferences, the language remained cautious. Localized heat source, centralized emission, uncharacteristic nucleus behavior. Behind closed doors, the words grew bolder. Engine, reactor, artificial core. A young astronomer in Chile, overwhelmed after a night of observing, blurted during a private call, "It looks alive, like it has a heartbeat." His colleagues did not laugh. They only fell silent, each remembering the faint pulses recorded by their own instruments. Governments, too, began to treat the idea seriously. Leaked fragments of classified memos suggested that defense agencies had already modeled the core as a potential compact power source, one with output far beyond anything human technology had yet achieved. If such an object could be harnessed, or if such technology truly existed, it would change the balance of civilization overnight. The possibility was enough to justify secrecy, enough to explain the tightening grip on data. Knowledge of the core was not just a scientific curiosity, it was a strategic asset. Yet the object itself gave no answers. It simply drifted onward, its heart glowing steadily, indifferent to human speculation. Each night it rose above the horizon, shining with the same impossible brightness, and each night humanity was left to wonder what whispered beneath its surface. A relic of a star? A device built by unseen hands? A living ember carrying its own pulse of energy through the void? The whispers of the core spread because they explained too much to ignore. They tied together the symmetry, the steadiness, the course corrections, the pulses, and once heard, the idea could not be unthought. Perhaps at the center of Atlas was not a comet's cold nucleus, but a heart that had been burning since before humanity ever looked to the stars. The shift in orbit. For weeks, the path of 3I divided by Atlas had been charted with exquisite precision. Observatories across the globe plotted its course against the background stars, feeding coordinates into supercomputers that refined its trajectory hour by hour. At first, everything matched expectation. A clean, hyperbolic arc slicing through the solar system, a visitor destined to glide past and vanish into the dark. But then came the numbers that should not have changed. It began subtly. Analysts noticed that Atlas was arriving at predicted coordinates just slightly ahead of schedule, no more than a few seconds at first. Then the discrepancy grew minutes instead of seconds, then kilometers instead of meters. The deviations were too consistent to be dismissed as error, and too small to explain with conventional outgassing. Comets often alter their course when jets of vapor erupt from their surfaces, but those corrections are messy, chaotic, never aligned. Atlas's shifts, by contrast, carried a precision that unsettled even the most seasoned observers. One internal report described it bluntly: trajectory adjustments resemble controlled navigation rather than random drift. That single line, buried in a technical document, spread quickly among those who had clearance to read it. For naturalists, the scientists desperate to preserve the idea that Atlas was nothing more than frozen debris, it was an unbearable suggestion. For others, it was a confirmation of what they had suspected all along. The object was not drifting, it was steering. The most disturbing evidence came when the trajectory change coincided with a predicted gravitational slingshot near Jupiter's sphere of influence. Instead of following the curve as modeled, Atlas adjusted just slightly enough to avoid a deeper gravitational pull. To those watching closely, it looked deliberate, as though the object had chosen to preserve its course, rather than surrender to the giant planet's embrace. This was the moment when the whispers about the core, the steady light, and the pulses coalesced into something more concrete. If Atlas had a compact energy source at its heart, perhaps it could use that energy for more than light. Perhaps it could use it for motion. The idea was simple and terrifying. Atlas might be propelling itself. Governments reacted quickly, though quietly. Military tracking stations were ordered to monitor its course continuously. Agencies that had once dismissed public curiosity as harmless now treated the comet as a potential craft. Meetings with astrophysicists turned tense, shifting from curiosity-driven discussions to cold assessments. If it can maneuver, then what does that mean for intent? No one dared to answer. Publicly, nothing was said. Press releases continued to describe Atlas as an extraordinary but natural comet, its deviations explained away as normal outgassing. But those who compared data from independent observatories saw through the facade. Amateur astronomers began to notice discrepancies between their own measurements and the official orbital charts. Online forums filled with speculation, posts vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The veil of secrecy grew thinner, and beneath it, fear thickened. Among scientists, the question shifted from "what is it?" to "why is it here?" Objects that can navigate do not wander without reason. They travel toward destinations. They follow purposes. And if Atlas had shifted its orbit deliberately, then it was not just passing through the solar system by chance. It was moving according to a plan humanity could not yet read. The night after the Jupiter deviation, a senior astronomer at an American observatory typed a line into his private log: "It knows where it wants to go." He did not mean to suggest consciousness, only that the trajectory had the unmistakable clarity of intention. Yet once written, the phrase lingered in his mind, a truth too large to ignore. And so, Atlas continued on its path, gliding with serene brightness, as if unbothered by the storm of speculation it left in its wake. But for those who understood the data, the shift in orbit marked a turning point. It was no longer possible to call it a comet without doubt. It had crossed the line from natural phenomenon to something else entirely, something that seemed to act with purpose. And purpose, in the vast silence of space, was more unsettling than any brightness could ever be. A warning in the data. When the orbital shift of 3I divided by Atlas was confirmed, the tension among those studying it thickened into dread. Deviations could be excused, light could be rationalized, but patterns, true, structured patterns, were harder to bury. And it was in the data, buried beneath the brightness, that the most unsettling discovery began to take shape. Radio astronomers had been listening quietly to Atlas for weeks, not because they expected a comet to speak, but because its anomalous brightness demanded attention across all wavelengths. At first, the signals were ordinary, a wash of static, the background hiss of the cosmos. But then came something different, a faint pulse, repeating, not strong enough to be heard by the casual observer, but sharp enough to raise eyebrows among those who filtered the noise with advanced algorithms. The pulse appeared in regular intervals, not perfectly mechanical, but consistent enough to defy randomness. At first it seemed like nothing more than an artifact, perhaps the interference of human satellites bleeding into sensitive instruments. But when the pulse appeared at the same time in Chile, in Australia, and in South Africa, sites separated by thousands of kilometers, the conclusion grew undeniable. The signal was real, and it was coming from Atlas. Teams working in secret compared their findings. What they discovered chilled them. The pulses carried a shape, a rhythm that was not simply repetition but variation, a sequence of long and short bursts, rising and falling like a code. Some saw the shadow of binary patterns, others likened it to a heartbeat, slow and steady, impossible to dismiss as random. One group of researchers, working in hidden collaboration, went further. They claimed that buried within the sequence was a cycle that repeated every 27 hours, aligning disturbingly with Atlas's observed surge in brightness. To them, this was more than coincidence. It suggested synchronization, as if the pulses and the flare were part of the same mechanism, broadcasting energy outward in deliberate cadence. Word of this leaked only in fragments. A draft report, briefly uploaded and then deleted, contained a single haunting line: "The object is transmitting." Though quickly scrubbed, the phrase spread through underground channels, sparking debates that official agencies scrambled to contain. Publicly, the silence held. Privately, the data pointed to something no one dared to acknowledge openly. Atlas was not just bright, it was communicating. The idea of communication raised darker questions. Was the signal directed outward, toward distant stars, a message intended for receivers far beyond Earth? Or was it aimed inward, toward humanity, waiting to see who might be listening? If the latter, then the implications were staggering. Atlas was not merely passing through, it was probing, testing, perhaps even warning. Skeptics tried to dismiss it, insisting that natural processes could mimic patterns. They spoke of rotational harmonics, of plasma instabilities, of coincidental timing. Yet in private, even some skeptics faltered. The human mind knows chaos, and it knows design. What emerged from Atlas was not chaos. It was too clean, too deliberate. It carried the uncanny weight of intention. Among those who studied the pulses most closely, a phrase began to circulate. A warning in the data. Not a message of words, not a declaration in human language, but a presence that made itself known through rhythm, through light, through the refusal to be mistaken for accident. It was as if the object was saying, "We are here, we are watching, do not ignore us." Yet the greatest fear was not what the signal said, but what it implied. If Atlas was transmitting, then it was not alone in its silence. Somewhere, someone, or something might be listening, and if they were listening, then perhaps they would answer. The debate of origins. By the time the pulses and orbital shifts of 3I divided by Atlas became undeniable, the scientific community fractured into camps. No longer could anyone hide behind the safety of cometary anomalies. The question had shifted to something more unsettling. Where did it come from, and what was it? The first camp clung to the comfort of physics. They argued that Atlas must be the fragment of a rogue star system, perhaps ejected debris from a collapsing binary, or the remnant of a violent planetary collision. In their models, exotic chemistry or radioactive decay explained the brightness, while gravitational interactions accounted for its path. These scientists admitted that the data strained their theories but insisted that natural processes, however rare, could account for even the strangest visitor. To them, to suggest otherwise was to abandon science itself. The second camp, smaller but louder in whispers, dared to consider that Atlas was an artifact. They pointed to the steady light, the symmetrical coma, the course corrections, and above all the pulses that hinted at coded intention. To them, the object was too precise, too deliberate. It resembled not a comet but a probe, dispatched long ago by an unknown civilization. They compared it to Earth's own Voyager spacecraft, small, steady messengers carrying signals across the void. If humanity could build such machines, why not others, older and more advanced? A third camp drew upon astrophysical speculation. They proposed Atlas might be a shard of dark physics, a piece of matter humanity had never encountered. Quark condensates, strangelets, or even fragments of dark matter clusters. In this view, its brightness came not from engineering but from a process beyond the reach of current science, one that mimicked intention without being alive or designed. To them, Atlas was neither comet nor craft, but a window into uncharted laws of the universe. And then there was the camp few dared to join publicly. Those who spoke of biological origins, the symmetry, the steadiness, the rhythmic pulses they suggested, not machinery, but metabolism. What if Atlas was alive, not in the fragile way Earth knew life, but as a vast interstellar organism, a creature feeding on solar radiation as it drifted between stars? To consider such a being was to redefine life itself, to imagine biology written in plasma and light rather than flesh and bone. Even the boldest among them hesitated, knowing such words would invite ridicule. Yet in the quiet of late-night discussions, the thought would not die. The debates raged in conference halls, encrypted calls, and private documents. Each origin carried implications too vast to fully comprehend. If Atlas was natural, it meant the universe still held processes undiscovered, physics that could reshape human understanding. If it was artificial, then humanity was no longer alone, and worse, no longer the most advanced species in the neighborhood. If it was biological, then life itself was far stranger and more resilient than anyone had ever imagined. Governments quietly fueled the debates by leaking fragments to different groups, testing reactions, probing for consensus. Yet consensus never came. Instead, the debates hardened into belief systems. For some, Atlas was proof of alien intelligence. For others, it was the herald of new science. For still others, it was an omen, a sign that humanity had glimpsed something it was not ready to face. But beneath the arguments, one truth united them all. Atlas did not belong here. Its origins were not of the solar system. It came from elsewhere, carrying mysteries locked inside its impossible light. And no matter which theory one chose, each led to the same chilling realization. The universe had just revealed itself to be larger, stranger, and far more dangerous than anyone had dared to believe. The darkest scenario. As debates about origins swirled among scientists and governments, a quieter, more unsettling conversation took root behind sealed doors. It was not the debate of whether 3I divided by Atlas was natural, artificial, or alive. It was the question of intent. And in that realm, the darkest scenario emerged. What if Atlas was not simply a traveler, nor a relic, nor a message? What if it was a scout? The word itself, whispered among defense analysts, carried weight heavier than equations. A scout meant reconnaissance. A scout meant it was not alone. A scout meant something larger might follow. If Atlas carried within it an energy source, if it could alter its trajectory with precision, if it pulsed with coded signals, then perhaps it was not drifting by accident. Perhaps it was here to look, to listen, to measure. And what follows a scout, history has often taught, is not curiosity but presence. Intelligence assessments painted grim hypotheticals. If Atlas was an engineered probe, it might be mapping the solar system, testing defenses, broadcasting reports back to unseen listeners. The light itself could be a form of communication, a signal designed to travel across interstellar distances. Some even speculated that the object's brightness was not just visible to Earth, but deliberately exaggerated to ensure it could not be ignored. Like a torch waved on the horizon, it announced, "We are here. We see you." In secret scenarios drafted by military planners, the possibilities grew darker still. What if Atlas was not passive but active, capable of more than light? Could its energy source be weaponized? Could its trajectory shift toward Earth, not away? No evidence supported such fears, but the absence of evidence was not comfort enough. The agencies had seen how quietly it had adjusted its orbit near Jupiter, how smoothly it maintained its symmetry. If those movements were deliberate, then Atlas was capable of control, and control could be turned toward any purpose. Among scientists, the darkest fear was subtler, but no less chilling. What if Atlas was not here to communicate or scout, but to judge? A civilization that could launch such an object might not care for dialogue. It might only wish to see whether humanity was worth acknowledgement at all. The pulse patterns, the brightness, the silence, these could all be tests, measurements of how Earth responded, of what humanity revealed under pressure. And if judged unworthy, what then? Even myths were dragged into the speculation. Ancient stories of sky torches and fire without smoke were reread as warnings. Had such objects visited before, testing other civilizations long gone, leaving only echoes in legend? If so, then perhaps Atlas was not the first scout, only the latest in a long sequence of silent inspections. That thought spread uneasily among those who studied both data and myth. Perhaps Earth had always been observed, its progress measured in intervals marked by wandering lights. Of course, The darkest scenario was not written in any official report. To put it on paper would be to give it form, to acknowledge a fear that could not easily be dismissed. Instead, it lived in whispers, in glances exchanged across conference tables, in the silence that followed when someone asked, "What if it's not alone?" And yet, the silence itself betrayed the weight of that thought, because once it had been spoken, no one could fully unhear it. If Atlas was a scout, then something greater was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it arrived. Hidden files unsealed. The silence of agencies and the terror of the darkest scenario might have endured indefinitely had it not been for the leak. It came not through the noisy channels of media or the cautious whispers of academia, but through a single whistleblower who had seen too much. One evening, a series of encrypted files appeared on a hidden server, their headers marked with dates stretching back decades. Within hours, they spread across the shadowed corridors of the internet, too fast to be erased, too widely copied to be contained. They were labeled simply Interstellar Object Monitoring, Archive. The files revealed a truth no one had expected. Humanity had not been caught off guard by 3I divided by Atlas. Decades earlier, long before Oumuamua, long before the word interstellar had entered common conversation agencies, had already predicted such visitors. The document spoke of early sightings that had never been confirmed, mysterious lights glimpsed on the edges of classified satellite data, anomalies dismissed publicly but filed quietly under pending review. One report from the 1980 seconds described a non-terrestrial luminous body that had entered the outer solar system, remained visible for several days, then vanished without explanation. Most damning were the projections. Since the 1970 seconds, according to these files, certain agencies had maintained models suggesting the solar system was intersected periodically by wandering interstellar objects. The models predicted that some of these objects would show anomalous energy output signatures inconsistent with natural debris. The files described them not as comets or asteroids, but as potential artifacts. No public acknowledgement had ever been made. What shocked researchers most was that Atlas's trajectory matched a scenario outlined nearly 30 years earlier in one of the sealed documents. A report dated 1994 described a predicted visitor that would approach from nearly the same direction, pass near Jupiter, and display abnormal reflective characteristics. The resemblance was uncanny. Either the prediction was astonishingly accurate, or someone had already been aware of Atlas long before it was discovered. The files also revealed a disturbing pattern. Every few centuries, there had been recorded instances of strange lights crossing Earth's skies, noted not only in myths, but in restricted scientific records. A 19th century naval logbook described a sphere of fire, visible for weeks at sea, dismissed at the time as a comet but exhibiting none of a comet's usual tail. A Cold War satellite captured unexplained pulses in the void, classified and buried before astronomers could analyze them. Piece by piece, the leaked archive painted a history in which Atlas was not unique, but part of a series of visitors, a sequence too regular to dismiss as random. The files did more than confirm suspicions. They shattered trust. Scientists who had long been denied data realized that their governments had known much more, for much longer, than they had ever admitted. The secrecy was not born only of fear of panic, but of control. Control of knowledge, control of technology, control of the narrative of humanity's place in the universe. Within days, the leaks ignited chaos. Forums exploded with speculation. Journalists demanded answers. Agencies denied the authenticity of the files, but their language was too careful, their refusals too rehearsed. For many, the denials confirmed what the documents revealed, that the world's most powerful institutions had been preparing for Atlas and for objects like it for generations. Among the leaked fragments, one passage stood apart, repeated and shared endlessly. Objects of non-terrestrial origin periodically traverse the inner solar system. Their energy signatures indicate mechanisms beyond known physics. Their recurrence suggests purpose rather than chance. Recommended classification: Sentinels. The word echoed like a stone dropped into deep water. Sentinels. Not wanderers, not accidents, but watchers. If the files were real, then humanity's first contact had not come with Atlas. It had been happening all along, every few centuries, under the guise of silence and myth. And suddenly, The impossible brightness of 3I divided by Atlas no longer felt like an isolated enigma. It felt like the continuation of a story long hidden, a story humanity had never been meant to know until now. The Watcher's fear. The leaks changed everything. What had been a mystery confined to observatories and secret agencies now became a fracture line running through the very core of governments. Behind locked doors, in strategy rooms stripped of windows and communication devices, leaders and intelligence chiefs confronted a truth they could no longer bury. If 3I divided by Atlas was real, and if the leaked files were true, then humanity was being watched. The word sentinel lingered in every conversation. A sentinel does not wander without reason. A sentinel observes, records, and reports. To those entrusted with the defense of nations, this was not an abstract puzzle of astrophysics, but a direct threat. If Atlas was a sentinel, then it meant it was part of a network. Where one watched, others might already be listening. Where one passed by, more could follow. And if these sentinels carried information across the stars, then someone or something was receiving it. Military planners drafted contingency scenarios with a grim efficiency. What if Atlas began to alter course toward Earth? What if its pulses escalated into a directed signal aimed at the planet itself? What if the object carried not only a beacon but a payload? These questions, though unanswerable, were repeated like mantras in classified briefings. And though no evidence suggested aggression, fear rarely waits for proof. The scientists brought into these rooms fared little better. Their warnings that panic could blind judgment, that the object showed no hostility, that it might simply be passing by, fell on ears too attuned to worst-case outcomes. Intelligence agencies had long histories of preparing for the improbable, and now, faced with an interstellar anomaly shining brighter than any comet, they leaned instinctively toward caution. The question was no longer, what is it? But what should we do if it is not friendly? Satellites were tasked with constant monitoring, not just of Atlas but of the skies beyond, scanning for any sign of other incoming objects. Communications networks quietly analyzed the pulses for potential code, while linguists normally trained for deciphering human adversaries were brought in to test for structure. Some swore they saw patterns, mathematical sequences buried in the noise. Others dismissed it as coincidence. But the debate itself revealed the truth. No one was certain anymore. Within the agencies, fear bred paranoia. If Atlas was a sentinel, then perhaps its watchers had already intercepted Earth's signals, the radio waves that had been leaking into space for over a century. Old television broadcasts, radar sweeps, encoded data transmissions, all of it traveling outward at the speed of light, announcing humanity's presence to the cosmos. What if Atlas had not come to find us, but to confirm what was already known, to verify that the voices from Earth matched a world ready or unready for contact? The fear extended beyond the halls of government. Whistleblowers who read the leaked files saw the word sentinel and carried it with them like a shadow. Activists argued that if watchers truly existed, secrecy would not protect humanity, only cripple its response. Religious leaders reinterpreted scripture in light of the idea that Earth had been under observation for centuries. And in private forums, ordinary citizens began to ask a question more unsettling than any military report. If they have been watching, then what do they think of us? For the watchers on Earth, the agencies, the astronomers, the governments, the fear was not simply that humanity was not alone. It was that humanity was not in control. Atlas drifted on its path, radiant and silent, immune to politics, untouched by denial. It had already come too close, revealed too much. And if it was a sentinel, then it had already done its job. It had watched, it had listened, and it had sent its message onward. What that message contained, none could say. Whether it was a report of curiosity, indifference, or judgment remained hidden in the impossible brightness. But for those sworn to safeguard their nations, the fear was clear. Humanity was not just observed, it was evaluated, and the silence of the universe no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. The question that remains: when 3I divided by Atlas finally began to drift outward, slipping past the sun's grasp and into the black beyond, it left the world divided between awe and unease. To the public, it was remembered as a curious comet, a brief spectacle for telescopes and backyard cameras, a visitor that came and went like a silent spark across the heavens. But to those who had seen the hidden files, who had studied the impossible data, it was something far more enduring, a question that would not die. The object's light faded slowly, but never fully in the way comets dim. Even as distance should have swallowed its glow, it burned with a strange persistence, a fading torch that seemed unwilling to vanish completely from human sight. Instruments strained to follow it, capturing the last whispers of brightness, until even the most sensitive arrays could no longer distinguish it from the cosmic background, and with its departure came a silence as profound as its light had been. Scientists were left with their fractured theories. Some clung to exotic chemistry, to radioactive decay, to the faint hope that one day an equation would explain what their eyes could not. Others carried their belief that it had been a probe, a beacon, a sentinel. Still others whispered of biology on scales unimaginable, of a creature whose heartbeat pulsed across the void. None could prove their vision true, none could disprove it either. Atlas had slipped away before answers could be wrestled from its brilliance. Governments tightened their archives, burying what the leaks had already made public, denying what had already been seen. They spoke of new monitoring programs, of vigilance, of preparing for future interstellar objects. But beneath the surface, their fear was plain. They knew the truth no denial could erase. Atlas had behaved in ways no comet should, and if one such object had come, another would follow. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not in a generation, but eventually, the Watchers, if that is what they were, would return. For ordinary people, the question became something quieter, something personal. They looked at the stars differently now, not with the innocence of seeing them as distant fires, but with the unease of knowing that something out there might already be watching back. The night sky no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited, charged with unseen eyes. Every point of light seemed like a possibility, every silence a veil, and so, humanity was left not with answers, but with a haunting. Why had Atlas burned so bright? What lay at its core? Was it truly alive, or built, or the relic of physics still beyond comprehension? Did it pass through by chance, or was it sent deliberately, like a scout, like a sentinel, like a messenger carrying news of Earth into the abyss? Most chilling of all, what message had it carried away, and to whom had it delivered it? The skies eventually returned to their familiar stillness, but for those who had witnessed Atlas, nothing felt the same. It had left behind no fragments, no tale, no dust to collect, only memory, only data, only the impossible question, glowing faintly in the minds of all who had studied it. Why was 3I divided by Atlas brighter than any comet, and what power, what purpose, lay within its impossible light?